Today we are discussing about the impact that offshore wind farm cables have on marine life and especially on lobsters. And I'm very glad to welcome Dr. Alastair Robert Lyndon, Associate Professor at School of Energy, Geoscience, Infrastructure and Society at Heriot-Watt University. Alastair, good morning. How are you?
Good morning. Very well, thank you.
Of course, I would like to start with a very interesting report that we have read, that lobsters are being deformed and left unable to swim because they are affected by the electromagnetic field from undersea electricity cables. Can you tell us a little bit more about this finding?
Yes. We've been interested for a while in the possible interaction of electromagnetic fields with marine life, and particularly invertebrate marine life. There's been a lot of work done on fish, for example, but not so much on invertebrates. And we previously found that, perhaps unexpectedly, that electromagnetic fields attracted adult crabs to electromagnetic fields similar to those predicted from offshore cables. And then we followed that work up looking at the early developmental stages, which is the recent report. And what we find is that for lobsters, this causes developmental defects in some of the larvae, which potentially reduces the number of viable larvae available to grow to adult.
Specifically regarding the impacts, we have read about this inability to swim that lobsters present after being affected by electromagnetic field. Can you tell us a little bit more about specific impacts on lobsters?
The impact of impaired swimming at the early developmental stages are quite important because the larvae of the lobsters are what we would call planktonic, which means that they float in the surface waters and they obtain food there and they grow from when they hatch from the egg stage until they settle out in the sort of juvenile lobster stage. We know very little about the survival at that point, but we imagine that it must be fairly variable because the adults produce so many eggs. In any case, this is usually a bet hedge against poor survival. So anything which affects the survival at that point is going to be perhaps significant. The ability to swim is important, partly in order to find food, but also to maintain position in the water column. If swimming is not possible, the larvae naturally are heavy and they will sink, and that takes them below the level at which there is abundant food in the surface waters. So they would be less able to feed. Also, if they're not able to swim so well, they're equally less able to avoid other things which might be trying to eat them, so predators. So there's a sort of double whammy here, that they might not be able to obtain food so easily, and they also might be more susceptible to being eaten themselves.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the research? Which process was followed to reach your findings?
Okay, the swimming findings were obtained using a swim test chamber, which effectively was something similar to a measuring cylinder you might have seen before, sort of cylindrical flask, which was blacked out along its height, but had a window at the bottom and the top where you could allow light to come in. And this was lit successively by using a handheld torch in a darkened room, so that the larvae were allowed to sink to the bottom of the tube. So the bottom window was lit so that they were attracted to the bottom. And then that was turned off and the light was shone at the top of the tube, and the time recorded for them to swim from the bottom of the tube to the top, which was around about 15 centimeters.
What's the impact on crabs or on other fish compared to lobsters?
That was also quite interesting in that, as far as we found for crabs, specifically edible crabs, which we've previously worked on, we found much less of an effect. We didn't see any significant difference in swimming speeds or in larval deformities between those crabs which had been exposed to the electromagnetic field and those which hadn't. So that was quite encouraging in a way that perhaps these are not all pervasive effects. Nevertheless, the larvae hatching in the electromagnetic field were generally smaller, both for crabs and lobsters. So this also has a potential impact in terms of the ease with which things can eat them. So predation might be increased, but that was something which we didn't directly measure, so it would require further work. But no, the crabs seem to be much less affected, at least on the measures that we used in this particular study.
Can you probably suggest any solution to this problem that could probably mitigate the impact on lobsters?
The impact could be mitigated fairly straightforwardly, I suspect, in terms of the exposure of the eggs during brooding. Lobsters and crabs both retain the eggs on the female's abdomen during the brooding phase, during the pre-hatch phase of the eggs. And it's this stage which we looked at in terms of the exposure to the electromagnetic field. The electromagnetic field drops off very rapidly with distance from the cable or wherever the field is formed. So burying the cables, which is already fairly standard practice in the industry, I believe, would help to mitigate these effects. One of our potential worries was, of course, that crabs, when they're brooding the eggs, they actually dig down into the sediment. So that might offset the protection given by burying the cable. Having said that, we've already seen that the crabs are less affected by this. So that perhaps is not such a big problem. So for lobsters, I would say burying the cables probably would be an effective measure. And as I say, one which is already fairly standard in the industry, but would be important to maintain in the future, because obviously it does cost more to do that. And in some areas, it might not be so easy to do if you have rocky substrate on the seabed and so on.
In terms of other observations during this research, have you also noticed other long-term impacts like long-term impairments or increased mortality on lobsters?
No, we didn't really notice anything of that sort. Interestingly, the lobster larvae, which were exposed to the electromagnetic field, seemed to show slightly better survival than those which were not exposed, and we're not quite sure why that is. So there wasn't any immediate effect on mortality. Longer term, we didn't do a longer term study. We looked purely up to the point where the larvae had hatched and developed for a certain period of time. What affects the sort of effects of size and obviously the deformities and swimming impairment might have longer term, we're uncertain, but we suspect that any impairment of that sort will tend to reduce the survival chances during the planktonic phase. But again, we'd need to do further work to confirm that that was the case.
My last question for you, Alastair, is are you specifically more concerned after the publication of the government's energy security strategy, which has put in its heart the expansion of offshore wind? What do you think about that?
I don't think I'm more concerned. I think it's really important that we strive to decarbonize our society and our economies, because I think the broader threat to the marine environment comes specifically from climate change. So anything we can do to reduce that, I think, is really crucial. What I would emphasize is that I think we don't want to have unintended negative consequences while we're doing that. So I think expanding the wind provision and the offshore power provision is actually really important, but that we need to be aware of any potential downsides. So thankfully, in this case, it looks as though the impacts might be relatively low, but nevertheless, there are effects, and it's something that we should keep a watching brief on.